You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium, available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about Genie Wiley, otherwise known as the Feral Child. With references to child abuse right from the start of the show, listeners' discretion is strongly advised. So it's over to you now, Mark, for this week's chilling podcast.
The name Genie Wiley, who was born back in 1957, is the pseudonym for an American feral child who was the victim of severe abuse, neglect and social isolation. It all started when Genie was 20 months old and her own father began keeping her in a locked room, and during this period he would either strap her to a child's toilet or bind her in a crib with both her arms and legs immobilized. And, as if that were not bad enough, on top of that, he also forbade anyone to interact with her, provide her with almost no stimulation, and left her severely malnourished. The event of Genie Wiley's isolation prevented her from being exposed to any significant amount of speech. So as a result, she did not acquire any language skills during her childhood. Eventually, in the November of 1970, her abuse came to the attention of the Los Angeles County Child Welfare Authorities, after which the 13-year, 7-month-old Genie became a ward of the state of California. Psychologists, linguists and other scientists almost immediately focused a great deal of attention on Genie Wiley's case, mainly due to the fact that the 13-year-old had not yet learnt any language skills, so linguists saw her as providing an opportunity to gain further insight into the process of controlling language acquisition skills and to test theories and hypotheses identifying critical periods during infant and adolescent growth in which humans learn to understand and use language. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in once again and listening to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a psychic medium, a ufologist and a true crime buff. And just to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every Monday night, although occasionally on a Tuesday, allowing for bank holidays and busy weekends, I do a podcast on the many wide and various subjects that fall under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters and all sorts of paranormal phenomena, including true crime and unsolved crime, and the many missing people that often go unnoticed. So, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any of the other many podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the sad story surrounding Genie Wiley, otherwise known as the Feral Child. And this week's necessary disclaimer. Well, this story is a tale that involves child abuse and cruelty, so may prove upsetting to some. You listen at your own discretion. Also, all opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts of the case remain. I also apologise if I pronounce anything incorrectly. Again, my English, although it is my first and only language, is probably easier to watch than listen to. Anyway, let us get back to this week's yarn. So, what do we mean when we talk about a feral child? Well, according to Wikipedia, a feral child, which is also known as a wild child, is a young individual who has lived isolated from virtually any human contact from a very young age. And as a result of this isolation, they have very little to no experience of human care, social behaviour or language, with such children lacking the skills of basic primary and secondary socialisation. The term feral child is generally used to refer to children who have suffered from severe abuse, trauma or other mysterious circumstances before either being abandoned or feeling that they have to run away from home. As a consequence of their actions, and in order to survive, these children are then forced to tap into their basic animal instincts. Some of these feral children, who were the victims of circumstances, are able to be socialised back into society and even learn to speak in order to tell others about their backstory, whilst others, that most likely had developmental disabilities, were so far gone that there would be no hope of bringing them back onto an equal level with people in their society. And just to point out here, while there are many journalistic accounts of feral children being found and raised in proximity to wild animals, there are no eyewitness accounts of animals feeding human children. Feral children are sometimes, on occasion, the subjects of folklore and legends, often portrayed as having been raised by animals, with one example being Tarzan of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan of the Apes, that was first published in 1912, becoming an iconic hero of novels, comic strips and motion pictures. Genie Wiley was the last and also the second surviving of 4 children born to parents living in Arcadia, California, in the United States. Jeannie's father, Clark Wiley, worked in a factory as a flight mechanic during World War II and continued to work in aviation after the war. During Clark Wiley's childhood, he spent most of his time being brought up in orphanages around the American Pacific Northwest. Clark's own father, or Jeannie's grandfather, was killed by a lightning strike, and his mother, meaning Jeannie's grandmother of course, ran a brothel, which meant she did not see her son Clark very often. And on top of that, Clark's mother, again meaning Jeannie's grandmother, gave him a feminine first name, calling him of all things Pearl, which made him, obviously, the target of constant derision and from other children at the various orphanages that he frequented, and as a result he harboured extreme resentment towards his mother during childhood. Actually, it kind of reminds me of that late 1960s song by Johnny Cash called A Boy Named Sue. Do you remember that one?
Oh, yes, I do. It's played often enough.
It's okay, people, don't worry. I won't sing it.
Thank heavens for small mercies.
Yes, okay, right. Anyway, to continue. Genie Wiley's mother, Dorothy Wiley, with the name Dorothy being another pseudonym, was around 20 years younger than her husband Clark and originally came from an Oklahoma farming family and had come to Southern California as a teenager with family and friends who were fleeing from the Dust Bowl. On an interesting side note, the Dust Bowl was the result of a period of severe dust storms that greatly damaged the ecology and agriculture of the American and Canadian prairies during the 1930s. If you want to know a little more regarding the 1930s Dust Bowl, I have already done a podcast on the phenomena in episode number 124, which is available on the same platform as this episode. As a young child, Genie Wiley's mother sustained a severe head injury in an accident, giving her lingering neurological damage that caused degenerative vision problems in one eye. When Genie's father, Clark Wiley, reached adulthood, he immediately changed his first name to one which was more typically masculine, and if I'm being perfectly honest with you, which I am, I can't say I blame him. And not only that, but his mother, after she pretty much neglected him in his youthful years, also began to spend as much time with him as she could. Clark Wiley eventually became almost fixated on his mother, and despite having relentless arguments with her over her attempts to convince him to adopt a less rigid lifestyle, all these said arguments did was convince him to treat all other relationships as secondary at best. After this first short break, in part 2, we will look at the potent relationship between Genie Wiley's parents and how she was neglected in her infant years.
This show is brought to you courtesy of Neil Packer and the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre. Find them online at www.hauntedresearchcentre.com or at 9 to 11 Regent Street, Hinckley, LE10 1AW. Open on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for guided tours of the haunted rooms at just £3 per person. Booking is essential at all times, and over 16s only, please, unless accompanied by an adult. The haunted rooms are extremely haunted, and paranormal activity could, and has, taken place at any time. Some areas and particular objects or items can be quite scary and unnerving. Membership is available for £25 to qualify for selective offers. And why not download the app, available on both iOS and Android, for only $3.99, to keep up to date with what is coming up at the centre.
Although Genie Wiley's parents, Dorothy and Clark, seemed initially happy to those who knew them, soon after they were married, her father, Clark, started to prevent her mother, Dorothy, from ever leaving the home and began to beat her with ever-increasing frequency and severity. And not only that, but Dorothy Wiley's eyesight, as mentioned in part 1, was also steadily deteriorating because of the lingering effects from her existing neurological damage, with the onset of severe cataracts and a detached retina in one eye. On an interesting side note, a cataract is a cloudy area in the lens of the eye that leads to its decrease in vision. Cataracts are often slowly... I'll do that one again. Cataracts often develop slowly and can affect one or both eyes with symptoms that may include faded colours, blurry or double vision, halos around light, trouble with bright lights and difficulty seeing at night, and as a result may cause trouble in driving, reading or recognising faces. Worldwide, cataracts causes 51% of all cases of blindness and 33% of visual impairment. These poor eyesight conditions for Genie Wiley's mother were leaving her progressively more and more dependent on her husband. Genie Wiley's father, Clark Wiley, disliked children and had long ago decided that he wanted none of his own. He found them, amongst other things, too noisy. However, at around 5 years into their marriage, his wife Dorothy became pregnant. And unlike most fathers who would have quite naturally been most elated at this news, Clark, in his own little wisdom of shit, decided he would reward his wife by beating her throughout the entire pregnancy. But not only did he beat her, he also thought that near the end of her pregnancy it would be a good idea if he also attempted to strangle his wife to death. But luckily for his wife, he failed at his attempts at strangulation. So, when she was in the hospital recovering from his evil psychopathic deed, she gave birth to an apparently healthy daughter. As you can probably imagine, things were not all that rosy in the Wiley household, with the child's father finding the baby's crying very disturbing, so much so that Clark Wiley found the best way to get peace and quiet in the home was to place the baby in the garage. However, this was probably not the best idea that our residential psychopath had ever had, as 10 weeks later, while she was left in the said garage, she died of pneumonia. The second child, born to Clark and Dorothy Wiley, approximately a year later, was a boy who was diagnosed with Rh incompatibility and unfortunately died at the age of just 2 days. On an interesting side note here, Rh incompatibility, or otherwise known as hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn, is an autoimmune condition that develops into a fetus or at around the birth when one of the 5 main types of antibodies produced by the mother pass through the placenta. Among these antibodies are some which attack antigens on the red blood cells in the fetal circulation, breaking down and destroying the cells. The intensity of this fetal disease ranges from mild to very severe, and fetal death from heart failure, otherwise known as hydrox fetalis, can occur. When the disease is moderate or severe, many immature red blood cells are present in the fetal blood. In cases of Rh incompatibility, RHOD immunoglobulin is given to prevent sensitization. However, there is no comparable immunotherapy available for other blood group incompatibilities. In the case of Rh incompatibility with the Wiley's second child, accounts vary as to whether his death was in fact the result of complications of the aforementioned Rh incompatibility or from choking on his own mucus. It is now 3 years later, and the couple had another son named John Wiley, whose doctors described as healthy despite him also having the aforementioned RH incompatibility. The boy's father forced his wife to keep the boy quiet, while consequently caused significant physical and linguistic developmental delays in his childhood. When John Wiley reached the age of 4, his paternal grandmother grew concerned about his lack of development, so much so that she alone took over his care for several months. And as the boy started to make good progress with her, she eventually returned him back to his parents, which, if you ask me, is a little like sending a fully fat live chicken into a pack of wolves that probably haven't eaten for about a week. Genie Wiley was born about 5 years after her older brother John. And it was around this time that her father, Clark Wiley, began to isolate not only himself, but all his family from the outside world. But I will go into more details of the family isolation a little later. Genie's birth was a standard caesarean section with no noted complications, with her being in the 50th percentile for weight. A short interesting side note here, and being a man, I wasn't even aware that this percentile thing was a thing. A baby on the 50th percentile for weight is an infant right in the middle of the normal weight range, meaning 50% of babies the same age are lighter and 50% are heavier. It's amazing what you can learn, isn't it?
Especially when you've got 3 children and 4 grandchildren.
Yeah. That's for all the men out there. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. Unfortunately, the following day, it was found by doctors that baby Genie also showed signs of the same RH incompatibility that her elder brother John had, which meant that she acquired a blood transfusion. But apart from that, as she had no sequelae, meaning any complications or conditions following a prior illness or disease, she was otherwise described as a healthy baby. When baby Genie was 3 months old, she was taken for a general medical appointment or check-up to make sure that she was still a healthy little infant. The check-up did show that she was gaining weight normally, but it also showed that she had developed a congenital hip dislocation. This meant that Genie was required to wear a highly restrictive fracas splint from the age of 4 to 11 months, which in turn caused her to be a late walker, with researchers believing that this incident was what led her father to start speculating that she was mentally retarded. Just a very quick side note here, a fracas splint is a kind of splint worn in early life to correct hip dysplasia. Genie's father then, under the incorrect speculation that his daughter had mental and physical health problems, therefore made a concerted effort not to pay any attention to her. And on top of that, like him ignoring her wasn't enough, he strongly discouraged her mother and her brother from talking to her as well. At the age of 11 months, Genie Wiley was still in overall good health and had no noted mental abnormalities. However, she had fallen to the 11th percentile for weight, which is down quite a lot from the 50th percentile that she was when she was first born. In later studies, it was believed that this drop in her weight was an early sign that she was starting to suffer from some degree of malnutrition. When Genie was 14 months old, she came down with a fever and pneumonitis, meaning that she was suffering from inflammation of the tissues in her lungs. So her parents decided to take her to see a paediatrician, but it was one she had not seen before. This paediatrician then informed Genie's parents that although her illness prevented a definitive diagnosis, there was a possibility that she was mentally retarded and that the brain dysfunction connectorus might be present. This, of course, further amplified her father's idiotic conclusion, and out of sheer ignorance, that his daughter, Genie, was indeed severely retarded. Six months later, when Genie was 20 months old, her paternal grandmother, the one who took care of her elder brother John, was killed in a hit-and-run traffic accident. Her death caused Genie's father, Clark Wiley, far beyond any normal levels of grief, and because his son John had been walking with her at the time of the accident, he decided to hold him responsible, which further fueled his anger. And it doesn't stop there, because when the driver who caused the accident only received a probationary sentence for both manslaughter and drunk driving, Genie's father then became delusional with rage. And just in case you were wondering what a probationary sentence is, a probationary sentence is a court-imposed criminal sentence that allows offenders to remain out of jail under supervision if they follow specific guidelines and conditions. Offenders on a probationary sentence must meet with an assigned probation officer regularly. Offenders on a probationary sentence must meet with an assigned probation officer regularly and adhere to court-specific rules. So yes, Clark Wiley was pretty pissed.
I think I would be too.
After this second short break, in part 3, we will look at the abuse that young Genie Wiley had to endure, her rescue, and how she is today.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07 852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk. Or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future? They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights Ghost Hunting Events. Remember, only the original will do.
Scientists believe that the events Clark Wiley went through, meaning the loss of his mother through the car accident and the rather lax punishment that was given to the driver, made him feel that society had let him down and convinced him that he would need to protect his family from the outside world. So Clark Wiley then completely isolated his family, first by immediately quitting his job and then by moving his entire family into his deceased mother's 2-bedroom home, where he demanded his mother's car and her bedroom be left completely untouched as shrines to her memory. And by believing that his young daughter, Genie Wiley, was severely retarded, he felt he needed to protect her even further. Therefore, in his wisdom, he decided it would be a good idea to hide her existence as much as possible. However, unfortunately, whilst causing this isolation, Clark Wiley lacked the self-awareness to understand or even recognise that his actions would cause more destruction within his family than any good. Upon the Wiley family moving to his deceased mother's 2-bedroom home, Genie's father increasingly confined his young daughter to the 2nd bedroom that was located at the back of the house, while the rest of the family slept in the living room downstairs. During the daytime, for approximately 13 hours, Clark tied his daughter to a child's toilet in a makeshift harness, which he had forced her mother, Dorothy, to make, with this harness being designed to function as a straitjacket. It was also designed so Genie could wear nothing but a diaper underneath, and that she could only move her arms and legs. And at night her father, Clark Wiley, would usually tie her into a sleeping bag and place her in a crib with a metal screen cover, keeping her arms and legs immobilized. Although some researchers believe that her father sometimes left her on the child's toilet seat overnight. When the family first moved into his deceased mother's 2-bedroom home, Clark Wiley occasionally allowed his daughter to be in the backyard inside a small playpen. However, her father soon lost his patience with her as she kept breaking it down to get out. So, as a remedy to his problem, he soon decided not to allow Genie outside at all and kept her entirely confined to the back bedroom of the house. Genie very soon learned that if she vocalised or made any other noises, her father would then beat her with a large plank that he kept in her room. Also, to keep her quiet, he, quite bizarrely, would bare his teeth and growl at her like a dog. And, even more bizarrely, he decided to grow his fingernails out just so he could scratch her. You see, it would go something like this. If he suspected her of doing something that he didn't like, say, for example, sneezing, he would then start to make these growling noises outside her door and then beat her if she continued to do it. And he thought that she had mental health issues. It has since been later reported by scientists that this is what instilled in Genie, later in her life, her intense and persistent fear of both cats and dogs. But because of this abuse by her father, Genie Wiley soon learnt to make as little sound as possible and to otherwise give no outward expression as to the way she was treated. At mealtimes, Jeanie's father fed her as little as possible, refusing to give her any solid food, feeding her only baby food, cereal, the occasional soft-boiled egg, and liquids. As you have probably gathered by now, Jeanie's father, Clark Wiley, had an extremely low tolerance for any noise, even to the point of refusing to have a working television or radio in the home. He almost never allowed his wife or son to talk to Jeanie and viciously beat them if they did so without his permission. This meant that any conversation between them was therefore very quiet and out of Jeanie's earshot, which consequently prevented her from hearing any meaningful amount of language. Jeanie's father also kept her room extremely dark, with the only available stimuli being the crib, the child's toilet, curtains on each of the windows, 3 pieces of furniture, and 2 plastic raincoats hanging on the closet door. However, when Clark Wiley was feeling a little generous towards his daughter, on the very rare occasion, he would allow her to play with a plastic food container, an old spool of thread, an old TV guide, and, of course not forgetting, on occasion, she could also play with the aforementioned raincoats. He is all heart, isn't he? And yes, my sarcasm is intentional. Throughout all this time, Genie Wiley's father almost never permitted anyone else to leave the house, with the only exception being that her brother was able to go to and from school. Some of the other bizarre things that her father did was that when her brother John came home from school each day, he was required to prove his identity through various means before entering the house. And to discourage any disobedience in the Wiley home, her father would frequently sit in the living room with a shotgun in his lap. Well, doesn't he just sound like a real keeper? And yes, again, my sarcasm is intentional. Throughout this time, Clark Wiley not only kept detailed notes chronicling his mistreatment of his family, but he also kept detailed notes on his efforts to conceal it. And according to one of their neighbours, no one in the neighbourhood knew about the abuse Clark Wiley carried out on his family, or that the Wileys ever had another child besides what they thought was their only son, John. Jeanie's mother, Dorothy, was passive by nature and was almost completely blind throughout this time. Her husband, Clark, continued to beat her and threatened to kill her if she ever attempted to contact her parents, any of her close friends who lived nearby, or the police regarding his treatment of his family, especially young Jeanie. Jeanie's father was convinced that she would be dead by the age of 12 and promised that if she did survive past that age, he would allow her mother to seek outside assistance. However, surprise, surprise, yes, more sarcasm, Clark went back on his promise, and when Jeanie did turn 12, her mother took no action for another year and a half. It is now October 1970, and Genie Wiley is now approximately 13 years and 6 months old. Jeanie's brother John, who by this time was 18 years old, had already run away from home and was living with some friends, and to be honest, who can blame him? One afternoon, after a particularly violent argument that her parents had, in which her mother threatened to walk out if she could not call her own parents, her husband eventually relented. So, later that same day, Dorothy Wiley left the family home with her daughter Genie in tow in order to go to her own parents' house in Monterey Park in Los Angeles. Around 3 weeks later, on the 4th of November, that same year, Genie's mother, Dorothy, on another rare occasion when she was allowed out, decided to apply for disability benefits for the blind in nearby Temple City in California, and, as a rare treat, she decided to bring Genie with her. However, on account of Dorothy's near blindness, they both accidentally entered the General Social Services office that was next door to the benefits office. The social worker who greeted them both instantly sensed that something was wrong when she saw Genie Wiley and was shocked to learn her true age after having estimated from Genie's appearance and demeanour that she was probably aged around 6 or 7 with possible autism. But after the social worker and her supervisor questioned Genie's mother, Dorothy, and confirmed her daughter's real age of 18, they immediately contacted the police, which resulted with both her parents being arrested and her becoming a ward of court. And because of Genie's physical condition, a near-total unsocialised state, a court order was immediately issued for her to be taken to the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. On the 17th of November 1970, news of Genie Wiley reached major media outlets and received a great deal of local and national attention, with one particular photograph that the authorities released of her significantly fueling public interest. And anger as well, I should imagine. And although Genie's father, Clark Wiley, refused to speak to both the police and the media, large crowds still subsequently turned up in order to get a glimpse of who this person was, with this attention being something that Clark Wiley, reportedly, found extremely difficult to deal with. On the 20th of November 1970, the morning before his scheduled court appearance on child abuse charges, Genie's father committed suicide by a single gunshot. Next to Clark Wiley's body, the police found 2 suicide notes, with one intended for his son, which in part said, and I quote, "Be a good boy, I love you." And the other note, which seemed to be directed at the police, although I should point out here that there are many conflicting reports as to what his note to them actually said, but the most popular theory is that the words, and I quote, "The world will never understand," seems to hold the most water. So, for this podcast, we'll go with that. After Genie's father committed suicide, the authorities and hospital staff exclusively focused on Genie and her mother, Dorothy. Many years later, her elder brother said that their mother soon began dedicating all of her love and attention to Genie. At court, Dorothy Wiley told them that the beatings from her husband and her near-total blindness had left her unable to protect herself or her children. So, with all the charges against her being dropped, she received counselling from the hospital. Within a month after Genie's admission to the hospital, a professor of psychiatry and behavioural sciences at the University of Oklahoma, one J. Shirley, took an interest in her case. J. Shirley noted at the time that Genie Wiley was by far the most severe case of isolation he had ever studied or even heard about, which is a position he maintained for more than 20 years. Over the next year and a half, J. Shirley came on three-day visits to conduct daily observations, hoping to determine if Genie was autistic, whether she had sustained any brain damage, and whether she was born mentally retarded. However, thankfully, J. Shirley concluded that she was not autistic and that he found no signs of any brain damage, noting that Genie had a high level of emotional disturbance but an eagerness for new stimuli. Over time, Genie Wiley quickly began growing up, putting on weight, steadily becoming increasingly more confident in her movements, had good eye-hand coordination, and was much better at focusing her eyes. And soon, after her admission to the hospital, she started to develop a sense of possession by hoarding objects to which she took a liking to, and becoming extremely upset if someone touched or moved anything she'd collected. After a few more weeks at the hospital, Genie Wiley became much more responsive to other people, and shortly afterwards she began paying attention to other people speaking around her. At first, her face and body language remained mostly unexpressive, and it was unclear whether she was actually responding to either verbal or non-verbal stimuli. However, during the later part of Genie's stay at the hospital, she started engaging in physical play with adults and eventually began to enjoy giving and receiving hugs. And again, over time, Genie would continue to exhibit feelings like frustration and have, like most young people at her age with normal teenage angst, tantrums that would end up in her sulking for a very long time. I've seen that before. At the time of Genie Wiley's admission to the hospital, there was a wide discussion in both the lay and academic circles about the hypothesis of the American professor and public intellectual Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky was the first to suggest that language was innate to humans, and it's what distinguishes humans from all other animals, with the linguist and neurologist Eric Lenenberg suggesting or hypothesizing that humans have a critical period for language acquisition and defined its end as the onset of puberty. However, despite the interest in these hypotheses prior to Genie's discovery, there had been no way to test these theories out. And although there are ancient and medieval texts that make several references to language deprivation experiments, modern researchers labelled such ideas as the forbidden experiment that are impossible to carry out for ethical reasons. Prompted by this coincidence of timing, meaning the discovery of Genie Wiley, of course, in the May of 1971, scientist David Wrigler led a team of, scientists who sought to obtain a 3-year grant from the NIMH, or the National Institute of Medical Health, to study Genie. To be honest with you listeners, the science, information, politics and experiments with young Genie Wiley is very long-winded and kind of complicated, especially for a small-time podcaster like myself. So I'm not going to get too bogged down with it all in this show, mainly because I don't like making my shows too long. So if you do want to know what sort of experiments, sort of things that these scientists did, then it's probably best to check out some of the websites online, because believe me, there's a lot of information out there on this case. But suffice to say, from what I can gather after being studied for 4 years, Genie was not harmed in any way and came out from these experiments in one piece, which is the most important thing, which I'm sure you all agree. In the May of 2008, ABC News reported that someone who spoke to them under the conditions of anonymity told them that a hired private investigator located Genie in 2000. And according to this investigator, she was living a simple lifestyle in a small private facility for mentally underdeveloped adults and appeared to be happy. She, reportedly, only spoke a few words but could still communicate fairly well in sign language. In 2016, Genie Wiley by then was a ward of the state of California and living in an undisclosed location in Los Angeles. Genie Wiley's brother, who was then living in Ohio, said in a rare interview that since leaving the Los Angeles area, he had visited his sister and their mother only once back in 1982, but had heard that they were doing well. Sadly, Genie's mother died of natural causes at the age of 87 in 2003, and her brother, John Wiley, died in 2011, and although I don't know the actual cause of death, it was possibly through diabetes or even a heart attack.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 126, we are going to be looking at the dark side of the Mother Earth cult. Love Has Won is an American new religious movement which was led by Amy Carlson, who is referred to within the group as Mother God, and who described herself as, among other things, the creator of the universe. The group has been described as a cult by many, including both ex-members and media outlets. Ex-members accuse the group of physical abuse and sleep deprivation, with members allegedly only being allowed to sleep for 4 to 5 hours a night, whilst most adults need between 7 to 9 hours sleep per night. But the Sagosh Country Sheriff's Office reports state that they had received many complaints about the group from families, primarily about brainwashing and fraud.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, and proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. The pronunciations of these silly names and places was all mine. The actors in this episode were Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes and Denise Pooler, with special thanks to Neil Packer, and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley. And of course a big thank you to everyone for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for Mark's Unexplained World podcast, but if you do know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner, including ufology, hauntings, disasters and any other sort of paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime, unsolved crime and missing people, just drop me a direct message and I'll see what I can do. I'll also include the name of the person who suggested the idea in the end credits in the end credits of the podcast as a thank you, if you want me to, of course. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any other podcast platform, again, give us a like and a follow. I thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember, guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. This show and all its contents are covered by the basic copyright of Mark the Medium.